Welcome to Future Talk. On today's program, we're going to look at the connection between neuroscience and compassion, and whether new understandings in neuroscience can enable us to be more compassionate toward one another, as well as more effective in all areas of life. My guest is James Doty, clinical professor of neurosurgery at Stanford University, and founder and director of CCARE, the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, which received its initial funding from the Dalai Lama. Dr. Doty is also an inventor, an entrepreneur, and the author of the new book, Into the Magic Shop, a neurosurgeon's quest to discover the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart. It tells how his bleak childhood of grinding poverty, family dysfunction, and dim prospects for the future turned around when he met a mysterious woman in a magic shop who changed the course of his life. Jim, great to have you on the program today.
Thank you, Marty. It's great to be with you.
Let's start with CCARE. What exactly does CCARE do?
Well, as the name implies, we actually explore the neuroscience of compassion and altruism. And the reason I have an interest in that is, as you point out, actually my own background as a child growing up in poverty. I saw actually the paradox sometimes between people who were in positions of power or had wealth or position, who actually, when they saw an individual suffering, did nothing. And then I experienced people being extraordinarily compassionate who had little, if anything. And that paradox stuck with me as I grew up. And ultimately, when I got into a position to explore this further, I wanted to understand what motivates people, if you will, to be kind, and actually why people are kind, and ultimately the benefit to kindness.
Is kindness a choice that people make, or does it just come naturally to some people?
Well, I think it starts with all of us to come naturally, and depending on your environment, your upbringing, and actually your genetic predisposition can determine how compassionate you are. The wonderful thing is, research shows that actually you can potentiate your compassion with certain types of interventions or exercises. And in fact, fundamentally, I did that myself when I met this, if you will, this mysterious woman in this magic shop. She taught me a technique that was really my first experience with neuroplasticity, or this ability to rewire your brain.
And this is all discussed in your book, and it's really a fascinating book. I read it. Maybe you could hold it up for the audience.
Sure.
Into the Magic Shop, you met this mysterious woman in a magic shop who gave you a series of exercises to do, which changed the course of your life.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. As a 12-year-old, from my background, I was already becoming a juvenile delinquent because I felt a sense of hopelessness and despair, and in fact, anger at my situation. And what had happened was I had had an interest in magic, and I had been riding my bicycle. In fact, it was an orange Stingray bicycle in an area of town where I usually don't go. And I came up on the strip mall where there's a magic shop, and I walked in. And the owner wasn't there, but his mother was there. And I describe her as an earth mother type of person, if you can gather what I mean by that. She had this radiant smile and this presence that was incredibly inviting. And for a 12-year-old, for a person like this to take interest in me and actually have a conversation with someone unusual, the interesting thing about her was it wasn't just hello, but she asked me about really who I was and what my background was. And normally I wouldn't share that information because I was ashamed. But for some reason with her, I basically told her my story. And at the end of about 20 or 30 minutes, she looked at me and she said, I really like you, and I think I could teach you something that could change your life. I'm here for another 6 weeks, and if you show up every day, I'll teach you this. And I did. And now retrospectively, I wish I could tell you I had some insight that motivated me to do that. But the fact of the matter was she had given me some cookies, which I liked. She was kind to me, and I had nothing else to do.
Now, it wasn't just kindness, was it? I mean, she was teaching you to be more effective in all areas of life. Kindness and compassion were part of that, but not the entire thing.
No, absolutely not. What many of us don't appreciate is that our ability to achieve goals or accomplish goals or tasks has a relationship to our ability to attend or be present and to focus. And for people who are from difficult backgrounds, oftentimes they live in a constant stress. And in fact, they're tense oftentimes. And she recognized this. And I described this in the book as Ruth's 4 tricks. And that first trick actually was learning to relax the body and be present and attend. And this is really one of the first techniques that is taught in a mindfulness type of practice. And once I had accomplished that, if you will, to her satisfaction, the next thing that she taught me was what I call taming the mind. What many people experience in Western society is an ongoing dialogue in their head. And oftentimes this dialogue is not one of self-affirmation or kindness. For many people, it's actually quite critical and judgmental.
That little critical voice that's always telling you you're no good?
Exactly. And this is very, very common. And the problem is that many people believe it. And they don't understand that this is a construct that has been created over time by imbibing negative feelings from people. And the thing is, if you don't believe you can accomplish something, or you tell yourself repeatedly you can't do it, by definition you cannot. And what she taught me was, first of all, that this dialogue exists. Because we become so familiar with it, we don't appreciate it's always going on. The second, what I didn't understand but understand now, is that these types of negative dialogues result in an emotional or physiologic response, which again stimulates this area of our nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system, which is our flight and fight response, which is associated with the stress response.
So you can train yourself to turn off those critical voices just by practicing?
Absolutely. In fact, the practice is, first of all, you have to recognize these exist. Second of all, you have to understand what's being said and not train yourself not to have that emotional or physiologic response. And then the third thing, you can actually change the dialogue, or as I talk about in the book, I gave the example of changing the radio station or listening to a different DJ, which is one of self-affirmation, kindness, and acceptance. And when you do that, your physiology changes. We'll talk, I'm sure, a little bit more about the autonomic nervous system, or this connection between your brain and your heart. And this is mediated through the vagus nerve. There are two parts: the sympathetic nervous system, which is your flight or fight response, and what we call the parasympathetic nervous system, or the rest and digest system. So many people have chronic stimulation of their sympathetic nervous system, which is associated with stress, anxiety, depression.
When you say sympathetic nervous system, what does that mean? The part of you that's sympathetic?
No, that's in fact some ways a misnomer. It's that part which is activated, if you will, when there is fear of threat. And when that happens, it results in increased heart rate, it results in decrease in cardiac function, it results in depression of the immune system, and it causes the release of cortisol and other hormones that on the short term, let's say on the savannah in Africa when you're running away from a lion, can be very effective, but return completely to normal when you're at your baseline. But when you're chronically stressed, there's this release of this, and on a long-term basis, this has a very, very detrimental effect on your health.
Now, is this something that you're actively researching? Because a lot of this sounds a bit like Tibetan Buddhism. In fact, the Dalai Lama provided the initial funding for CCARE. So are you taking Tibetan Buddhism to a higher level? What's the connection there?
Well, the reason many people study, if you will, Tibetan Buddhism and some of their practices is because, one, it's a practice that has been shown to be useful over thousands of years, but there are other types of meditative or introspective practices through other faiths, actually. But the Tibetans are unique in that they have created something called a language of mental life, which is actually quite complex, and it allows one to actually study these different states more clearly. So a lot of people have focused on Tibetan Buddhism. But like I said, there are other practices, the Kabbalah, Sufism, centered prayer in the Christian faith. that can have similar effects. But this work was begun initially to study meditation effects on the brain, but more recently it's been seen how powerful compassion is in terms of affecting your physiology in a positive way, that people have begun to focus on this. But you're absolutely right. The Dalai Lama has been interested actually in neuroscience for decades. And if you know anything about him, he's a very inquisitive, extraordinarily bright, insightful individual. And in fact, when I first started studying this area, and I have to tell you, I still don't know exactly why, but we'd begun some preliminary research, which I called Project Compassion. As I was walking through the Stanford campus one day, the Dalai Lama's face popped in front of me, and I had this feeling that I should ask him to come speak at Stanford. And I'm not a Buddhist. In fact, I'm an atheist. I didn't have that much familiarity with the Dalai Lama. But long story short, I ended up getting an audience with him, and it was extraordinary. He was very interested in this work. He immediately agreed to come to Stanford. And at the end of the discussion, he became quite animated and began talking in Tibetan to his primary English translator. Now, he speaks English quite well. But at the end of that conversation, his translator, whose name is Thupten Jinpa, turned to me and he said, "His Holiness is so impressed with this endeavor you've begun, he wants to make a personal contribution." And at that time, it was the largest donation he had made to a non-Tibetan cause ever. And this was at our very first meeting.
So he has some discretionary funds if he wants to support something.
Well, he's written a number of bestsellers, and he takes that money and he has a discretionary fund. And the vast majority of it goes towards Tibetan relief.
Now, is compassion a choice that people have to make? Because some people will say, you know, this is a dog-eat-dog world. After I have everything I want for myself, then I can concern myself with maybe being kind toward other people. How do you deal with people like that?
I try not to.
You must run across them sometimes.
Oh, no, I run across them. But the thing is, a lot of people say, well, this is what Charles Darwin has shown. You know, it's a dog-eat-dog world, and, you know, it's the fittest who survive. And the reality is, though, that Darwin never said this. In fact, what he said was, it is the survival of the most sympathetic, in fact, meaning the most kind or compassionate. It was Herbert Benson, who actually was an economist, who made that statement, but it had nothing to do with the animal world. He was talking about an example in the economic environment. The reality is that science has shown that while ruthlessness may benefit one on the short term, in terms of a species, it is cooperation, kindness, nurturing, caring that allows a species to survive in the long term.
Now, some people might say that mankind is divided into groups, so you're kind and compassionate toward people who are in your group and ruthless toward people who are not in your group. You think that the force of compassion could transcend all of these divisions, or are they simply permanent?
Well, you're exactly right. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the evolution of our species, and just to start at the beginning quickly, to have what makes us human, which is theory of mind, abstract thinking, complex language, it required a significant enlargement of our cortex. The challenge was, though, that as a result, our litter size decreased, and I say "our" in the sense of all of us, but actually women. Our litter size decreased, and there was an absolute requirement that our offspring are cared for. Unlike other species where they run off into the forest or the woods or the jungle, our offspring requires to care for them.
They're helpless for an extended period.
15 years, maybe. In my case, apparently 35. Yes, you're exactly right, because we have this mirror neuron system, and their training, their understanding, their imbuing of what they are actually comes from modeling their behavior after us. And it turns out that the resources and the energy necessary to care for our offspring are such that we have to be rewarded in some way. And we are rewarded with oxytocin, one of the hormones, which is called the bonding or love hormone. And when we receive that for caring, our reward centers or pleasure centers are activated. But the interesting thing about our evolution, and you know that evolution is not perfect. And there are two things that stick with us, unfortunately, because remember, our DNA has not really changed from 200,000 years ago when we were, in fact, on the savanna in Africa. And you alluded to this. One is the sympathetic nervous system, which in the modern world for which we were never designed, this is in many people chronically stimulated and results in this flight or fight response and the release of these hormones and these other deleterious effects that I alluded to.
Is that the bombardment of all the sensory stimuli, the rapid pace at which information comes to it and things change?
Absolutely. And we're not prepared for that. We were not designed for that. Technology moves almost exponentially while our evolution moves at the most slow of a snail's pace. And as a result, the other component that has stuck with us, and in fact is very detrimental, is tribalism. And this is this tendency to be with people who look like us, act like us, think like us, or at the same socioeconomic class or race. And unfortunately, when resources are scarce or your sympathetic nervous system has been manipulated to be stimulated by creating perhaps artificial threat, there's a tendency to withdraw and to be with those who you feel safe with, and those are typically the people who I described. The problem is that when that happens, number one, you stop sort of looking at the greater world and how you can participate in care. And the other thing, though, that happens is when the sympathetic nervous system is stimulated, areas in our brain start shutting down. Those include our ability for creativity and other functions associated with our executive control area in our frontal lobe. And that can be associated with productivity, but also rational decision making.
You know, like fear and panic will shut down your rational process?
Absolutely, because it becomes an automatic response, not a thoughtful response, because you're just going into survival mode. And when you don't think clearly or rationally, then you start making mistakes.
Now, is this what you train people in? So with CCARE, do you have people coming to you for compassion training? They take a course or are given some exercise. Their goal is to be more compassionate and overcoming some of the fear responses, and through this course they gain those skills.
Exactly. And what we are now appreciating is, like happiness and even certain genetic potential for being athletic in certain areas, 50% of it probably is a genetic response, but the other is an environmental. And it turns out that few of us, if you will, exercise or maximize our muscle of compassion. What happens with these types of trainings, which we've developed at Stanford and other research centers have developed, is that it allows us to potentiate that. And it's extraordinary because we have a course at Stanford, and what happens is once a person completes that course, they're in a much calmer state. Those hormones associated with the stress response are decreased. And in fact, I can't tell you the number of times spouses will say to me, my partner is completely different, because people don't appreciate they carry this stress with them in their interactions with their spouses, their children, their employers, and it's horrible, horrible in regard to health, because we know now, in fact, that when you practice compassion with intention, it is as beneficial as being at your ideal body weight, as exercise, and actually if you're a male over 50, quitting smoking. Profound.
Now in your book you were taught about compassion, but you didn't exercise it right away. You're more interested in getting the good things in life, so you went to college even though nobody in your family ever had done that before. You became a neurosurgeon, very successful, invested, made a ton of money, then lost it all in the dot-com bust. And only then you thought, well, I forgot about the compassion part. But I mean, is the compassion part, like the icing on the cake, something you do after you master the other stuff, or?
Well, no, frankly, I was 12 years old, and when you grow up in poverty, what happens is that you believe that money gives you power, which gives you control. Prior to my interaction with this woman, Ruth, in the magic shop, I described my life as being as if I was a leaf being blown by an ill wind. I never knew what was going to happen next. And so I thought that the most important thing was to try and control my environment. And the easiest way to control your environment is if you have money, because you can make decisions and have things happen, which being without money you cannot do. And so I really focused on that. And it was only after I lost everything, if you will, that I gained everything. Because when I was at my peak in terms of my quote-unquote success, where I was driving a Ferrari, I had a Porsche, Mercedes, all these different cars. I lived in this big house overlooking the ocean. I was single at the time and was dating very attractive women. I had never been more unhappy. Because what I thought would make me happy, or if you will, give me sustenance, actually had no calories, or were empty calories, if you will. It was only when I lost everything and then reflected back on this interaction I had had with this woman so many years ago that I realized that the thing I had missed was really focusing on being selfless and caring. Not that I was ever bad or totally selfish, but it was a different perspective. And it was when I made that the center point of what I do or who I am, then it changed everything. And what happened is when I ultimately lost everything and effectively was bankrupt and had to get rid of my Ferrari and my penthouse, et cetera, I was in the situation where I had had stock in a company which had yet to go public, and I had made some obligations to charity. And my lawyer said, well, listen, you've lost all your money. You don't have to live up to those. But I ended up deciding to live up to those. So I gave the stock in this company away. And that company ultimately went public for $1.3 billion. And I ended up giving tens and tens of millions of dollars away to charity. And in fact, that allowed me to create the center at Stanford. And it's allowed me to really focus my life on caring and being of service. And that has changed everything, and is probably the most fulfilling thing in my entire life.
Now, you've been working on a concept called the reciprocity. There's a concept that some futurists call the singularity, which is an exponential increase in technology, which gets to the point that it radically transforms the world almost instantaneously. Now, how does the reciprocity compare with the singularity?
Well, what a lot of people don't appreciate is that as we understand more or develop this concept of artificial intelligence or machine learning, et cetera, this will profoundly influence decision-making by individuals, but not necessarily with their knowledge. People assume that they have free will and the decisions we make are after deep thought. In fact, that's not the case. Our environment actually gives us cues which have a huge impact on decision-making. As we learn more about that reality, that can then be manipulated. And it can be manipulated by those who have that information. Who has that information? Private corporations. Imagine a future where an entity knows everything about you, from your finances to all your GPS locations.
We're getting pretty close to that.
Yes, who you've spent time with. And when you walk into a store or a building, it can read your facial expressions, know your emotional state, and then start creating an environment to have you, let's say, buy something, or to be angry about something, or to make a decision in their favor.
To manipulate you for profit.
Absolutely. And where are the ethics? Where are the organizations that force transparency or make people understand this reality? At this point, there really aren't. Now, people talk about it, but my limited experience is when you let for-profit corporations self-regulate, they never self-regulate. They continue to work for their benefit. So the idea of this reciprocity or reciprocality, but the idea behind this is that, first of all, we think of what benefits the common. And force transparency so that you have an absolute clear understanding of how these are all happening, and in fact, that you force it to benefit everyone. And you can opt in, you can opt out, and you force these organizations to, if you will, understand that we're all in this together and it's not just about greed and profit. And ultimately create organizations which are self-regulating, which are independent, but all fall under this domain of being of service to the rest of humanity. Because imagine, right now, we already see there are the haves and the have-nots. Now, as we see wealth inequality continue to widen, imagine this group of people of the haves who now control all of this other decision making. It only leads to further inequality, and potentially, as jobs are being lost to technology, there's a whole group of people who could be determined to be not useful at all.
We just have about a minute left. Are you optimistic that the idea of the reciprocality, that compassion will gain traction in the broader population? You're confident that that will occur and that the forces resisting and opposing that will ultimately be overcome, or is this like a long-term struggle?
Well, I think it is a long-term struggle, but I am optimistic. And as people learn more about some of the realities of neuroscience, or this response of us to be tribal, when people gain insights about who they are, what motivates them, what drives them, and get educated about it, become more self-aware, then I believe they will ultimately demand this. And hopefully, all parties will understand that we're in this together and there is no planet B.
Right, one would hope. And this has been a great conversation. We are going to have to wrap because I've gotten the signal. I've been speaking with James Doty, professor of neurosurgery at Stanford University, founder and director of CCARE. Jim, thanks for being here. Great talking to you.
Wonderful, Marty. Thank you for having me. And I look forward to seeing what happens in the future with these areas.
Thank you for watching. Visit our website, www.futuretalk.net. For Future Talk, I'm Marty Wasserman, and we'll see you next time.